of where the HS2 passengers are coming from. And what we're finding is that in the new business case, there are actually less coming from car and air. So we have less modal shift than before. And let's have a look at this, where here we've got a table of the sources of passengers and how they've changed between March last year and the new business case on the right. And if we just look, for example, at the air and car lines to begin with, we'll see that previously they accounted for just 8% each of the HS2 passengers. Now they've become 6% and 7% respectively. But of course they're of a smaller figure now. So to give an example, air, instead of being 11,000 journeys per day transferring, it's now only just over 8,000. Which, if you think of it in journeys per annum and millions of journeys per annum, what we're saying for air is we've got just under 3 million journeys per year are going to transfer from air to HS2, and just over 3 in terms of car. Now, you wouldn't think that from all the rhetoric that you hear about the business case, where one's hearing it's going to take cars off the roads and it's going to take people off domestic flights. As you can see, the largest proportion is obviously people switching from existing rail. So you've got 31 million of those journeys coming from existing classic rail. And then I mentioned how HS2 itself will cause an uplift. It's going to attract new people to travel who previously didn't travel at all. And you can see that now we've got some 22% of our forecasted passengers come from brand new trips. And that's hardly green to have people now travelling on a train. So, what about these original concerns for our benefits? Well, the most concerning one is the value of time saved. What the Department for Transport are doing is they are still basing it on this pretense that all time on trains is wasted. Now, we all know, indeed Philip Hammond himself admitted that he works on trains. So they had to put a defence in. They've said, OK, we could take it into account. But if we did, they said, well, actually, the crowding benefit would be greater if we did. And also, those switching from air and car would benefit. Well, let's take this first one. Would crowding actually benefit? Well, we realise there is an issue there. But it's entirely artificial because, believe it or not, HS2 is actually more crowded than a legitimate alternative railway. HS2 has a load factor of some 58%, whereas a legitimate alternative, such as Rail Package 2, something that's uprating the existing infrastructure, has a load factor of only 51%. So crowding benefit wouldn't actually be greater. The only reason why it comes out that way is because of the way that DfT have done their calculations. They have compared HS2 with an artificial do minimum situation, an artificial do minimum situation in which they don't do anything about the excessive crowding that builds up and up, whereas a genuine alternative wouldn't be like that. Secondly, when they said, it's those switching from air and car, we'd have to, of course, include a benefit there. But as we increasingly know, technology is changing so fast in relation to air that very soon we'll be able to use increasing amount of technology for people on planes, and we'll be working on planes considerably more than now. Which then leaves it perhaps just by 2033, or 2026 when it comes in, obviously, just the car benefit. And as we've seen, that car benefit is just 7% of all the passengers on HS2, 9,500 per day. So, in summary, the line that they have taken, which is to say we are still going to do the calculations as if all your time on trains is wasted, is invalid and an illegitimate approach to take. Secondly, of course, you have to value this businessman's time. So it isn't just that they're saying there's going to be this improvement in productivity, but how do you value it? Well, what they do is they value it at businessmen's salaries, because that is the saving that there is to the business. But they use a figure that's some 10 years out of date. And having got this figure of 10 years out of date, and the reason why it's important is some 10 years ago, it was a much smaller cadre of more top earners that did travel on trains as businessmen. But having got this figure, they then totally ignore the fact that they are using a huge increase in businessmen who are going to be travelling on trains. There's a fourfold increase built into their estimates of the number of businessmen travelling on trains, and you would therefore have expected the average salary to have come down, because obviously it would now be spread over a wider group of businessmen. But they haven't. They've left it at a figure that in today's money approximates to 70,000 a year for salaries. Thirdly, they use an unrealistic comparator. Now, to do a net benefit ratio and to do cost-benefit analysis, you have to compare your case with something else. So they have to compare HS2 with something. Now, they don't compare it with an alternative like Rail Package 2, which is of uprating the existing infrastructure. Instead, they compare it with something which just presumes only planned capacity or service changes, and that is just up to 2014 and not beyond. So it doesn't even take account on the West Coast Main Line of extending the fleet to 11 car for every train. And of course it ignores all the transformation which is going to be absolutely certain by 2043. So we would say the comparator they do it with is unrealistic. And finally, they don't create scenarios. They don't do proper scenario planning or proper sensitivity analysis. Now, their own guidelines say that they should produce scenarios, that they should have a downside one as well as an upside one. And also, remember the HS1 experience. HS1, as many know, they did actually do scenarios. They did a downside scenario. And actually, the demand that arrived it wasn't even as great as the downside scenario. And they haven't done a proper sensitivity analysis. Obviously, demand is crucial. And if you're going to do a proper sensitivity analysis, the least they should have done was have used the new forecasting factors which are in the Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook 5. But they didn't. So it is unsatisfactory as regards scenarios and unsatisfactory as regards the sensitivity analysis. Now, it's just worth thinking about, so what would the figures be if we corrected this business case? Now, I hasten to say this is a provisional assessment. This is 2 weeks in before any responses in terms of freedom of information requests. So I'm sure these figures will change. However, if we just said, just from the issues that we've looked at, in terms of the demand and in terms of the benefits, how might we correct them on that basis? Well, as we know, on the left there, we've got the DFT's net benefit ratio figures. For phase 1, we had that 1.6, and for the full Y, the 2.2. Now, if we corrected those benefits, and particularly, obviously, we're thinking of the value of time there, the phase 1 goes down to 0.6, and the Y is also still below 1. If we, however, correct also for the demand, the fact that it isn't using the latest forecasting factors, you will see that it drops to something like 0.3, or perhaps when we include the wider economic benefits, something more like 0.5. I think the clear thing it shows is that we are going to get a net benefit ratio well below 1. And 1 is an important threshold because once it's below 1, it's treated as poor value for money, and schemes certainly below 1 don't proceed. Another way of thinking about this is that what we're now going to be saying, if we're down at a figure like 0.3, is that £1 cost is going to deliver just 30 pence or maybe 50 pence worth of benefit. Hardly something we should be proceeding with. Now, I mentioned there are still concerns with the alternatives, and this is the alternatives of uprating the existing infrastructure. And the issue here is that they are both buried and they are both misrepresented in the new business case. And these are the cheaper, the better value for money, and the risk-free alternatives. And I say risk-free because it means that you can implement them a bit at a time, so that as the demand emerges, so you can respond. And if the demand doesn't emerge, then you don't need to put all your eggs in one basket with something like HS2 that doesn't deliver until 2026. The first point is that a best option was never actually created. It was never created in the business case last year, and it hasn't been created again, even for West Coast Main Line. For example, Rail Package 2, which was the one with the best value for money return, it didn't even go as far as having 12 car. It only went to 11 car, and 12 car would have delivered a better return, and indeed the Atkins work that was done for DfT last year showed that 12 car could be done. But secondly, what have they done with it this time? Well, they have bundled them into different scenarios for the Y. So we don't get a phase 1 answer. What we get is 3 different scenarios for the Y, and the West Coast Main Line bit, which was the Rail Package 2, is bundled in with the alternatives for East Coast Main Line and alternatives for Midland Main Line, because you need all 3 to address the Y. So, our Rail Package 2 option, which was substantially better, and we could see that in the business case last year, has become buried with much poorer options for the Y. And those benefits are hidden inside something called Scenario B. And if it hadn't been for the fact that one was able to look at it in detail last year, one wouldn't have known that from just looking at the figures now. Perhaps more seriously, I think, is that the RP2 capacity is misrepresented. It is misrepresented because what it's saying is that, well, RP2 does produce more capacity, but only a bit, about 54%. In other words, nothing like this doubling that we're looking for. But actually, it does deliver all that's needed, and indeed way more than delivered now, we believe, in terms of the demand forecast that's required. But it actually delivers 135% more capacity. And that is crucial. It can also be done sooner, it can be done incrementally, and as I mentioned before, it has less crowding than HS2, and it must have a better net benefit ratio than HS2. So it's better value for money, and crucially, it can produce the capacity that's required. It's been misrepresented because it's been bundled up with West Coast Main Line and Chiltern, and it's then been presented as an addition on top of the due minimum. It's not been presented.